I shared with you a few weeks ago that, just as a reminder, there are some people that they believe that when our loved ones die and go to heaven, they can't see what's happening on earth. And the reason they say that, and believe that is they believe that if they saw us with our failures, our struggles, our heartaches, that would make them feel sad. And there shouldn't be any sadness in heaven. And I understand that position, and I think it's valid, and I respect it. But I myself do believe that our loved ones who have gone beyond to the kingdom, I believe that they can see at least a part of our lives, at least the accomplishments and the successes and the progress that we're making. I really sincerely believe that. And the reason that I do is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings to us so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. And I don't believe that those witnesses are limited to cherubim and seraphim and other celestial beings. I really believe that our friends and loved ones are part of that. And so I believe that they are in heaven, and in their way they are cheering us on. And so with that in mind, I wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into Hebrews 11, because I believe that those people mentioned there are among the witnesses. And if you recall, 3 weeks ago, we talked some about that. We looked at the life of Abraham. And today I would like to look a little bit further into the life of Moses. So in Hebrews chapter 11, I'm going to begin reading with verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn may not touch them. In this race that you and I are running, if Moses could literally come down and travel with us, I think when it comes to him, there's much to admire. He's one of the greatest leaders in all of history. And if he could talk to us, I'm kind of putting words in his mouth, but I do think that if he could talk to us, he would tell us things like the faith of his parents and the creativity of his mother, putting him in a basket in the Nile River to preserve his life and protect him when he was a baby. I think he would talk to us about the encounter with God at the burning bush. How awesome that must have been. I think he would talk about the parting of the Red Sea. And not only was the sea parted, but they were able to walk through on dry ground. And I think he would talk about receiving the 10 Commandments. And I would certainly hope he would give us some leadership insights. Can you imagine leading a group of 2 million people who never stopped complaining, who often rejected his leadership, and more than once threatened his life? And as we would run together, I think he would say to us, live life in the faith lane, not in the safe lane. I believe that this man who spoke to God face to face as you and I speak with each other would say this to us. Each person's life story is written in risk. The ones we take and the ones we avoid. Let's look at his life. Do we think that we would know his story if he hadn't taken a risk? If he had played it safe with his life? As it pertains to his relationship with God, I think the greatest moment of Moses' life was probably his encounter with God at the burning bush. Now, as spectacular as that was, when you compare that to the plagues, watching God move through the plagues, watching him part the Red Sea, being there with the thunder and the lightning and receiving the 10 Commandments from God, I think what happened in the burning bush as far as spectacle goes pales in comparison to those. And yet, it was the most important. Because the decision that Moses made that day wrote his life story for the next 40 years. Without that decision, there are no plagues, no parting of the Red Sea, no receiving of the law. That decision affected his relationship with God, and it altered how you and I would know and remember him. But when he came to the moment of that decision as to how he was going to live his life, either continue to play it safe or to live by faith, there were 3 things that Moses had to overcome. First of all, Moses had to overcome the experiences of the past. Moses was born in danger and uncertainty. Pharaoh was afraid of a Jewish uprising, so he ordered all the male babies to be killed. And yet his parents disobeyed him and honored God and protected their son. His mother put him in God's hands. And when he was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, he lived a life of comfort. He grew up in a palace. He wanted for nothing. He grew up in the household of the most powerful nation in the world at that time. When he was 40, he took a risk. He tried to do something on his own. And he ended up killing an Egyptian while trying to defend a fellow Hebrew. And what was the result? His grandfather wanted to kill him. And Moses had to leave everything behind. For the next 40 years, he lives in exile. He lives in the desert. I think if Moses was typical, he remembered his experiences in Egypt. And I think he was like a cat who once sat on a hot stove and determined he would never sit on a stove again. Do something big for God? Relieve the oppression of his people? Not Moses. He had learned his lesson. He's going to stay where it was safe. The second thing that Moses had to overcome was the comforts of the present. John Maxwell wrote this, and I think it's really true. It might come across kind of harsh. I don't mean for it to, but I do think it's true. When he wrote, "Sad is the day when a person becomes absolutely satisfied with the life he is living, the thoughts he is thinking, the deeds he is doing, when there forever ceases to beat at the door of his soul a desire to do something more for God." I do believe that. And after he fled from Egypt, Moses spent the next 40 years of his life tending sheep in the Midian wilderness. Moses adjusted. He accommodated, he got accustomed to the lifestyle of the desert. It became a safe place where he could put his life on cruise control. He didn't have to worry about assassins from Egypt. He became part of Jethro's family. He married one of Jethro's daughters. Together they had a son. He had a secure place in the family business, and he was heir to that business of his father-in-law. It wasn't the palace, but he made a good life for himself. It was comfortable. It was safe. And when God called him, he was 80 years old, well past middle age. Why would he want to go anywhere at that point? And then third, he had to overcome the insecurity of the future. When God called Moses to live his life in the faith lane, he had to leave a comfortable life and go back to Egypt, where he was still a wanted man, and go and fulfill his life mission. And he felt totally unqualified to do that. But you know what? When we feel totally unqualified, that's the place where God wants us to be. Because then we have to rely totally upon him. When we realize that we're not smart enough, strong enough, powerful enough, rich enough, capable enough to do what God is calling us to do, that's where he wants us to be. He had no confidence in himself. He felt insecure about the future. He was filled with doubts and questions. I think of those in Exodus chapter 3 and 4. He said, "Who am I that I should go? Who shall I say sent me? What if they don't believe me? I have a speech impediment." You know, I've heard people say that Moses was making excuses. I don't think he was. I think Moses had good, legitimate reasons why he felt he could not do that. And yet, every time Moses had an objection, God had an answer and he had a solution. And he does for me. And he does for you. But Moses is still afraid after God offers all these solutions. And so he cries out, "Lord, here I am. Send Aaron." And God refuses to take no for an answer. I remember, it's a little over 6 years ago, I left Ameriprise and I went to Edward Jones. And I won't get into details, but there were changes coming in the industry. There were changes in my work situation where I knew I had to make a change. And I had been successful enough to stay employed, and not wash out. And to have to leave and start from scratch at age 59, I felt like a failure. And I felt like a loser. And I was sitting in an airport in Chicago waiting for my connecting flight to St. Louis for my first trip of training there. And this little Jewish woman, I know she was Jewish because she told me, she just sat down next to me. Now, when I travel, the introverted part of my personality kicks in. I don't talk to anybody. I don't want anyone talking to me. I mean, that's just how I am. Well, she's Jewish. She won't talk to me. And I found out, that she was going back home to St. Louis from Chicago. She had come up for her monthly facial. She was well-to-do. And I don't know. Usually I'm very guarded, especially around people I first meet. But I began to talk. And I don't remember exactly the words that I said. But I did indicate in some way that I felt like a failure at 59. And she looked at me and she said, I think it takes a great deal of courage to do what you're doing. I had never thought of that before. I was thinking, what if this doesn't work out? I'm going to bring disaster on my family. I had never looked at that before. And I was struggling starting out with them. And ever since then, when I feel inadequate, when I feel like I'm failing, when I feel like I can't do this, God brings me back to that conversation and helps me change my perspective. Having courage doesn't mean you have no fear. Having courage means you don't let the fear have you. You don't allow it to paralyze you, to keep from moving forward. Whether it's a change in your job, a change in your career, a change in relationships. You rely upon God. Even though he was afraid, Moses did the one thing, the only thing that helped him, that helps me, that helps you when we are uncertain about our future. He leaned upon God, the one who knows our future in every detail. And because he did that, because he leaned hard on God, he was able to live in the faith lane. As we finish our lap with Moses, there are 3 quick thoughts I want to leave with you this morning. None of us naturally leaves the safe lane. We all have something where we have to overcome. There is always something there that could keep us there if we let it. None of us naturally leave that lane. Moses didn't want to leave Egypt initially, 40 years before. It was all he knew. But yet, without leaving Egypt, Moses never would have experienced the burning bush, the parting of the sea, the receiving of the law. He never would have spoken to God face to face. And I would say this, just because you don't want to do something doesn't mean you shouldn't. Doesn't mean you shouldn't. That very thing that you don't want to do may be exactly where God is leading you. The second thing that I would share with you is growth begins when we exit the safe lane. It was only after Moses left Egypt that he truly discovered what was important in life. And it was then that he learned how God intended to use him. And notice, it was only when Moses was willing and said yes that God equipped him, that God gave him what he needed to carry out that mission. He gave him Aaron to speak for him, to overcome his speech impediment. He gave him Aaron's rod, through which God demonstrated his miracle working power. It was when he said yes that God came and gave him what he needed. He does that for me. He'll do that for you. And then the last thing I would share with you, while the safe lane is comfortable, it's really a detour to nowhere. Many people are so frightened by risk. They live their lives in Egypt, the place of not enough. They just grind out their life, and they survive day to day, stressed out and worried and overburdened. And I'm not just talking about financially, but I mean spiritually, emotionally. They're just getting by. Some people will break out like Moses and head to the desert, but they'll be content to live forever in the land of just enough. God wants more than that for you and me. He wants you to travel in the faith lane.